Well, this is the 9th video on the history of the Russian Revolution, and the first one examining a new part of the revolutionary process, the dual power situation that resulted from the February Revolution, the revolution described in previous videos. Now, it's worth remembering that the bourgeois leaders of the progressive bloc had spent the February days of revolution in hiding, fearing the worst. Now, to their astonishment and delight, they found that the Menshevik and social revolutionaries were handing power over to them behind the backs of the revolutionary masses. Now, the key political strategist for the bourgeois was Pavel-Milyukov, the leader of the Cadet Party. Unlike some of his more liberal colleagues, many of whom had had socialistic leanings in their youth, Milyukov was unashamedly a representative of the bourgeois class. And while the petty bourgeois socialists dreamt of uniting the proletariat and bourgeoisie in some kind of liberal alliance, Milyukov understood, just as Lenin and Trotsky did from the opposing camp, that the interests of the two classes could never be reconciled. He knew that despite the Soviet leadership, the revolutionary masses were never going to willingly surrender power to the bourgeoisie. However, without support from the people, Milyukov recognized that his class was in no position to break the revolution. Its only hope was to bide its time, to maneuver, to gradually outwit the revolution. So the bourgeoisie decided to continue with the policy that they had been using from the very start of the negotiations with the Soviet EC, to try and avoid any firm decisions and to postpone all reforms to some unknown future date. Above all, Milyukov and the cadets wanted to avoid, as Trotsky put it, the fatal question of convoking a constituent assembly in wartime, because they knew that as things stood, this would result in a crushing electoral defeat for the bourgeois parties. So, on March the 6th, the Provisional Government declared it would summon the people's representatives to a constituent assembly at the earliest possible date, but carefully avoided saying exactly when that date would be. And nothing was said about the form of government. Milyukov still hoped he might be able to resurrect the monarchy as a point of support for the reaction. The only firm promise in the declaration was to honour the secret treaties with the Allies and to carry on with the war. Trotsky sums up the situation as follows. So far as concerned the most threatening problems of the people's existence, the revolution had apparently been achieved only in order to make the announcement, everything remains as before. Now, although largely responsible for its political direction, Milyukov did not become leader of the Provisional Government. This grey, cowardly and unpopular man too sharply reflected the political essence of the bourgeoisie. Instead, he took the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, leaving the post of Prime Minister to the rich but politically very ordinary Prince Lvov. The rich landlord Rodzianko, president of the Provisional Committee of the Duma, had been pushed to one side. His ability to mediate between the monarchy and the property owners, now unwanted, his ability to mediate between the property owners and the revolution, too transparently lacking. The rest of the ministry was made up almost entirely by those wealthy landlords, industrialists and bourgeois politicians that the Duma had been recommending to the deposed Tsar since 1915. The Octoberist leader Guchkov became war minister, united with Milyukov in a determination for Russia to continue the war. The portfolio of finance went to the extremely wealthy property owner Tereshchenko, that of agriculture to the mediocre cadet deputy Shingarev. Trotsky explains, the fact is that with one single exception, the revolution accomplished by workers and soldiers found no reflection whatsoever in the staff of the revolutionary government. The exception was Kerensky. Now, over the years, the capitalists have learned that there can be at times distinct advantages in involving workers' leaders in the business of government. Abusing the trust that the masses place in them, these traitors can persuade the workers to put up with measures that they might never accept from a bourgeois politician. And with this strategy in mind, the Russian liberals tried to ensnare the Menshevik president of the Soviet, Chaidze, with the offer of the Minister of Labour. The Soviet Executive Committee had, however, voted against its members entering the government. Now, this hadn't been done for reasons of high revolutionary principle. No, they simply knew that the Petrograd Soviet had no sympathy for the bourgeoisie. So, as Trotsky puts it, raising the question of having Soviet ministers in the government ran the distinct risk that the Soviet might simply answer, the power ought to belong to the Soviet democracy. So the Soviet EC decided it would be safest to avoid taking any of the responsibility for the mess that had been created. Instead, the bourgeoisie should be left to have sole charge of the revolution that the Menshevik theorists, after all, had said was only for the bourgeoisie to lead. Kerensky, on the other hand, a lawyer and president of the small Trudovik party of Narodnik intellectuals, who had become one of the vice presidents of the Soviet EC, was not weighed down by any such theoretical considerations. He just wanted a place in the government and saw no reason why he should turn down such a golden opportunity to boost his fame. So without warning the Soviet leaders, he announced at a full session of the Soviet that he was ready to die for the revolution, but more immediately he was more than ready to take up the position of the Minister of Justice. Now, convinced by Kerensky's promise of a complete political amnesty and a prosecution of the Tsar's officials, the inexperienced assembly gave him a mighty round of applause. Kerensky took this as a vote of confidence and promptly accepted the post in the government. The Soviet EC, under the leadership of Sukhanov and the Mensheviks Chaidze and Skobelev, were fairly content with the outcome. They had successfully avoided taking the power that they so dreaded, and were able to announce support for the Provisional Government insofar as it truly served the democratic revolution. Or, as Trotsky put it more pointedly, the support was promised only as a reward for good behaviour, that is, for fulfilling tasks alien to it, and which the democracy itself had declined to fulfil. The EC set up a contact commission as a go-between to negotiate between the Soviet and the government. This ludicrous body became, of course, just a talking shop in which two irreconcilable classes would try and fail to reach a mutually agreed compromise. As for Kerensky's portfolio, once the question had passed without too much trouble through the Soviet, the EC leaders were happy enough. After all, now the intelligentsia had their own man in the government to let them know what the capitalists were up to. Now the revolutionary masses viewed the situation with very different emotions. Trotsky describes how among the workers and soldiers, the composition of the government created an immediate feeling of hostility, or at the best a dumb bewilderment. The name of Milyakov or Guchkov did not evoke one voice of greeting in either factory or barrack. One officer reports the sullen alarm of his soldiers at the news that the power had passed from Tsar to Prince. "Is that worth shedding blood for?" they asked. The only name that was greeted with any enthusiasm was that of Kerensky. In fact, he was now being made out by the bourgeoisie to be the central hero of the revolution. Trotsky explains how the inexperienced masses saw Kerensky's participation in the government as the first step towards the removal of the bourgeoisie and the landowners altogether. They just wondered why he was there alone. What they didn't yet recognise was that Kerensky, in Trotsky's words, was not a counterpoise to the bourgeois government, but instead a finishing touch, a screen, a decoration. And the masses didn't trust or support the bourgeoisie. They didn't really even distinguish them from the nobility and the bureaucracy. They put their weapons only at the disposal of the Soviets. And these had now sprung up out of the blue, thanks to the tradition of 1905, giving them tremendous power. It's worth reading this section from Trotsky, explaining how the masses went over in droves to the socialists, whom they identified with the Soviet. Not only the workers and soldiers, but all the many-coloured small people of the towns, mechanics, peddlers, petty officials, cab drivers, janitors, servants of all kinds, feeling alien to the Provisional Government and its bureau, were seeking a closer and more accessible authority. The masses poured into the Soviet as though into the triumphal gates of the revolution. All that remained outside the boundaries of the Soviet seemed to fall away from the revolution, seemed somehow to belong to a different world. And so it was in reality. Beyond the boundaries of the Soviet remained the world of the property owner, in which all colours mingled now in one greyish-pink defensive tint. Not all the toiling masses chose the Soviet. Not all awakened at once. Not every layer of the press dared instantly believe that the revolution concerned them. But all the active elements of the masses poured into the Soviet, and activity prevails in times of revolution. Moreover, since mass activity was growing from day to day, the basis of the Soviet was continually broadening. It was the sole genuine basis of the revolution. Now, in bourgeois circles and the Allied embassies, the new government had been greeted with satisfaction and relief. Nevertheless, the capitalists didn't feel that they were really in charge. Under the Tsar, despite the intrigues of Rasputin and his clique, the bourgeoisie felt they had real influence. If nothing else, the factories, land, banks, houses, newspapers and so on had been guaranteed to the property owners. But the February Revolution threatened to call this all into question. The bourgeoisie had the external attributes of power, but knew full well that, in Guchkov's words, the government, alas, has no real power. The troops, the railroads, the post and telegraph are in the hands of the Soviet. The simple fact is that the provisional government exists only so long as the Soviet permits it. A comment from a leading deputy in Guchkov's Octoberist party adds further detail to this accurate observation. He said that the Soviets seized all the Post and Telegraph Bureau, the wireless, all the printing establishments, so without its permission it was impossible to send a telegram, to leave Petrograd, or to print an appeal. Trotsky adds, however, it is necessary to introduce one slight correction. The seizure by the Soviet meant merely that the workers and clerks in those enterprises refused to submit to anybody but the Soviet. The reality was, indeed, that real power was in the hands of the Soviets. All of the upper layers of society, officers, directors, landlords, factory managers and so on, felt that they were under the constant suspicious scrutiny of the masses. The Soviet had become an organised expression of the masses' distrust. Trotsky says, typesetters would jealously follow the text of articles which they had set up. Soldiers would glance around suspiciously every time their officer made a move. Workers were dismissed from the factory, an overseer belonging to the ultra-reactionary Black Hundreds, and taken under observation a liberal manager instead. The Duma from the first hours of the revolution and the Provisional Government from its first days became reservoirs into which flowed a continuous stream of complaints and objections from the upper layers of society, their protests against excesses, their woeful comments and dark forebodings.